Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me Fallon Clark of Fallon Edits. How are you doing, Fallon?
I'm doing well today, Marquise. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. I'm excited about this particular discussion, particularly with you. I don't get to have these types of talks with professionals all that often. There are a lot of very skilled amateur authors, but you have a lot of experience in the field, and I'm really excited to get your take on things. Today, we're going to be talking about theme in relation to fiction. I'm calling this episode delving into the depths. So it'll be quite a lot of fun. But before we begin, I'm going to direct all of you over to my website where you can find more of these podcasts at wildislelit.com. I've got the whole list. I think we're 20, I think this will be episode 24 or 5 if I've counted correctly. So there's tons of material. There aren't just the writing cast. I also have my general Wild Isle podcast where I talk about all manner of things. So go over there and have some fun while you're there. If you have a manuscript, there's two different places you can go. Fallon, I'll give her a chance to pitch her story guide and coaching service, but I have the Wild Isle style guide. My focus here with the style guide is to help authors refine their style to both reflect, would say I would describe them as lost skills from both the pulp era and the classics that we don't really see in modernity anymore. So, if you wish to polish your manuscript with the, I don't want to say the power of pulp. I was trying to do an alliteration with P there on the fly. Head over to the Wild Isle Style Guide at wildislelit.com. And while you're there, you can also check out my novel, Wand Smoke Broken. It's a weird fantasy fiction novel that reads somewhere between like a Western and a literary novel. It's fun. It's a nice episodic adventure. If that interests you, you can listen to or read the first chapter for free. Again, at wildislelit.com. All right, I'm done shilling my stuff. Fallon, where can we send people to check out your stuff and your services?
I'm in a few spaces, Marquise. I go by Fallon Clark. My website is fallonedits.com. I'm a story development coach and editor. I'm also on LinkedIn. So I try to post a lot of content that just delivers value and helps people on a self-editing journey when they can't afford to pay for professional services. So if you need resources and want something to guide your self-editing process or something to guide the story writing process, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and grab any of the PDF resources I put out on. I try to do something at least on a weekly basis, if not more frequently, just to continuously provide value where I can.
Yeah, please do check out Fallon's content. And again, if you're looking for it was story coach, that's the proper term.
Yeah, so I focus on developmental editing. So whether you have an idea for a story and need help sort of fleshing out all of the nuance and details in order to jumpstart the writing, or whether you have a finished first draft and you're looking for a one-on-one sort of close developmental edit in a coaching capacity, I'm the person to help you with that. I don't look at manuscripts and provide red line commentary. I'm not going to mess up the words. I want to have a conversation about the story development, about what's happening in the story, so that an author can take that feedback and implant it in their own writing. That way, the story is always 100% the author's, and my hands haven't really been on it. So it's kind of this beauty of collaboration happening in a conversation space.
Yeah, and well, maybe the listeners won't be surprised. That's actually a really great service. It's very difficult to do editing of any kind or coaching of any kind without having, let's say, too much of, I don't want to say an influence because you want to have an influence, but
Mhm.
let's say to bring out what the author is trying to put down. I guess I'll say it that way. All right, let's go ahead and move into today's conversation, which is theme. Now, as I like to present myself as a philosopher, I always start with definition so that everyone, me, you, and the listeners are all on the same page. So, Fallon,
Sure.
when we're talking about fiction, um, and I use the word theme, what does that mean to you?
So for theme, I separate theme from the major message of a story. So I'll talk about theme first. When we talk about theme, I'm really talking about the topics or subject matter that the story fits into. And themes are something that's very personal for each reader. Sometimes authors don't even realize the themes that they've implanted into their fiction novels, especially if they haven't worked with a developmental editor to really pull those themes out and refine them. But readers pick them up on their own. It's an interesting process because the same novel can have different themes for different readers depending on their perspective and sort of the constants in their life as they go into a piece of reading material. Themes are not something you're ever going to find usually stated in plain words. Themes usually come from a character who's not your main character, but it's they're always going to describe the general topics that the fiction novel sort of fits into, whether it's family and romance, or there are themes of deception or collusion, nature, man versus self. There's a whole bunch of themes, and it's all topic specific.
Okay, so we've got the general subject, the general idea, the general topic,
Mhm,
usually
mhm,
communicated in a recurring fashion. Um,
mhm.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question definition for a different literary. Um, I hesitate to call it device. Element is probably the right word, and that is motif. So we've just outlined theme, but I want to ask about motifs and what you think about a motif, and then we're going to compare and contrast those here in a bit. But yeah, so we've got theme, that general subject, general idea. What's a motif then?
Sure. For me, the story's motif is really the soul of the fiction novel, right? It's the one message that the author is attempting to communicate to readers. So packing in all of those themes, what is the one takeaway that you want your readers to have? It's the underlying idea that you deliver. Can be, if your story is about sort of family and family dynamics and things, maybe the motif is that it's important to break free from your family in order to realize your true self. So there are ways that themes sort of fit into motif, and motif absolutely informs the themes of a story, but I see them as two very different things. Yeah, so motif would be sort of the message or the lesson behind the novel.
Okay, so what's really interesting here, I think we both look at theme and motif very differently. Um, I actually look at the definitions are roughly the same but inverted. So typically I end up using the word motif in the way that you use theme, and theme and use the motif. However, I have a multitude of literary textbooks from when I was teaching in university, and
Mhm.
they don't do a very good job, any of them, of hammering out theme and motif from one another, and they use them in back and forth ways. So I think this is probably
Sure.
actually a really good conversation to have, because I do think, regardless of whether we use the words theme or whether we use the words motif for the definitions that you just gave, because I actually have those same definitions here right
Sure.
in my notes, just applied on the other words. So we're going to be, for whatever words you choose to use out there, listeners, um, don't focus on the word, focus on the definition, the concept that that word is defining. Um, if I would go in and throw my definitions for these things, I mentioned they were
Mhm.
flipped. I like to go to the etymology of a lot of words, and I did
Sure.
this particularly when I particularly started teaching. I would pull, go to make a PowerPoint and then go in and I have this like big thick etymology dictionary, and of course you could just go online and do the same thing. It's much quicker. But when I looked at the word theme, I noticed it came from both, I think both the Greek and the Latin roots actually come from the word thesis, right? And
Yes.
this was something that was really relevant to me because I taught not only literature courses, but composition courses.
Mhm.
And that definition you gave for motif really fits onto essentially um, a thesis, right? It is you mentioned like the message, right, or the lesson. Another way to
Sure.
describe that might be like the moral of the story. Um, that, of course, uh, begs the question, well, what exactly is the moral of the story? And would you say that it's fair that the lesson, the message, the moral of the story is a kind of argument? Would you say that's fair to say?
I think it is. Absolutely. It's it's the major idea that the author is communicating to the audience, right? The raison d'être for the piece as a whole. There's almost no fiction author I've spoken to who wrote their novel in a vacuum and doesn't want readers to take away some greater meaning from that.
Yeah, and that opens up a whole can of questions that I know that the
Hmm.
listeners are wondering, right? So, okay, so we've got this kind of central thesis, right? It's in the narrative. But the questions, this is the question I get asked the most is what if the reader gets a different message than what is intended? Which is I guess is kind of like a death of the author question, right? Like, so is
Yeah.
the central message, is the central argument, the claim? I like to use the word truth phrase, truth claim for this. Is it contingent upon purely the text? Is it contingent upon the reader's relationship with the text? Is it contingent upon the author and what the author intended? How do you understand that central thesis, what I might call a theme, what you've outlined as a motif?
Sure. So it's very interesting. A lot of where that theme comes from, or where the motif comes from in the context, is in the language that the author chooses to use to write the story. But from the language, the author's voice, if it doesn't come through in the words on the page, the author's intention will get lost. And readers are then tasked with finding the meaning for themselves, which is why some stories resonate very well with some readers and don't with others. A big one I think in pop culture that shows up as potentially a contentious novel for some is Atlas Shrugged. If you're a person who is enticed by the idea of rugged individualism and what it means to pull yourself up to create a sufficient life for yourself. You may be interested in the themes of that novel. But if you're someone who is not necessarily interested in self sufficiency, if that level of objectivity doesn't suit you well, you may look for other themes in that novel to sort of describe your reading experience, and you may pull on the history and power of technological advancement, for example, rather than sort of the individuality backed in the theme. So it really depends on both. I'd say it's really the words, and it's the reader's perception of those words through the reading process. And I think the author's intention is almost nullified once the book is in the reader's hands, because at that point it's up to the reader to take that story and to sort of absorb it in any way that seems authentic to the reader themselves.
Yeah, I like that. Authentic to the reader themselves, right? So what that suggests is that the author's intent may find its way into the book. It also may not, and in fact, that also suggests it's possible that the reverse of what the author intended can be picked up by the readers or the listeners. There is a book that was made into I guess we'd call it like a cult classic film, Starship Troopers by Heinlein. And what's the reason why I bring that book up is because the it has a similar what I would call theme, what you've outlined as motif, a similar thesis, we'll say, to bridge that
Sure.
gap to Atlas Shrugged. The say philosophical backgrounds of the authors are somewhat similar, but when that book was made into a film, the director, or perhaps it was the writer for the film, I guess it would be the director, right? Because they have a book to go off of. Did not actually understand, had not read the book, and did not understand it, but had a an inverted perception of the thing that he hadn't read. Yet, this is where it's really interesting. Yet, when the film came about, the thesis of the film was actually the same as in the book, despite the director's attempt to produce something that he thought was the reverse of that, right? So, in this case, we have the author, his intention not being picked up by a director whose intention was also not embedded into the film and therefore was not picked up by his audience, which really suggests that there is something that is in the text itself that
Mhm.
interacts more directly with the reader. Um, Now, Fallon, the question that gets brought up immediately in my mind is the thesis, if we will, is that, would say, there in the text itself, or is it only there as it emerges from the interpretation of the reader? And then that begs a second question. If it is the interpretation of the reader, is the is does that make the thesis of a work subject to that reader, or is it possible that readers can misread? Like, is it objectively there in the text, or is it a matter of the subjectivity of the readers? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think it can be both. In the storytelling process, or the foundational steps of constructing a good story from beginning, middle, and end, really lies the foundations of theme, right? So somewhere, usually in Act One, to take the three act structure and sort of expand it, you're going to find both in fiction novels and in films that usually someone other than your main character is going to state the theme in some fashion. It may be a quick line of dialogue. It may be a greater musing, something that the main character becomes aware of in some fashion. So readers are going to get a sense of the theme from the text on the page. There is an objective sort of implanting of theme in sort of the natural storytelling process. But beyond that foundational sort of underpinning of theme is the sort of layer of reader subjectivity on top of that.
Okay, so there is an object, which is like with the theme that is present there in the
Mhm.
story, but then we've got, um, let's say, interpretive structure. I would, to make a not, I guess not crude, but I'll use the word crude comparison. One may or may not see that the door that is normally opened is closed, and you can't say that the person saw that the door is closed, but the door is closed, and so they will still run into it if they try to walk through it, um, which is a way of saying that yes, it is there in the text, but
Mhm.
no, that doesn't mean that the reader will see it or that the reader won't see it for something else. Um, I want to ask a question about the reasons for the theme or the thesis of a work of fiction being essentially out of the hands of the protagonist. Because I think that's an interesting point that you've brought up multiple
Mhm.
times now, so that it definitely has some significance. Would you be willing to elaborate that a little bit or on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So usually the one, the major thread, the major thesis of the story is something that the protagonist ends up learning for themselves. It's part of the life lesson, and the way that the protagonist learns that lesson takes on various shapes, and it's probably not going to be obvious. That learning process is transformative. It's part of the character arc and the development journey for the character. But that theme is it is part of the underlying structure. The reason that the main character usually does not land on the theme themselves is because the theme is something they have to learn over the course of the novel. If they state it up front in Act One, the learning is done. They already know that truth. They know that lesson. And then it's just, sort of headbanging to figure out why they haven't actually adopted a practice to get that into their lives. Over the course of a work, the protagonist is going to move through, from that initial glimpse of the theme in the early part of the story. They're going to go through, their the transformation process, both in terms of plot and in the internal and external journey of that character. And they're usually going to get to the understanding of what that theme means right near the end of Act Two, before you get to the big finale. So they have that sort of aha moment where they either reflect on something the character, another character said in the beginning of the story, or they've finally come up to speed to be able to understand on some level what that other character was talking about. And they get sort of in that space, the character is going to learn what that theme actually is, be able to make the necessary changes to complete their character arc. Then they're going to go through that finale process. So it's because it's part of the protagonist's overall character development journey. It's generally not the protagonist who's going to state that theme on their own.
Yeah, this really, the fact that the protagonist, and for those of you out there listening, who may not have the academic, I don't want to say training, education is probably the right word, to understand all of the, let's say, the meanings loaded into the terms. Protagonist doesn't just mean main character. I see that used
Mhm. Yes.
among the lay people quite a lot. But like really, what protagonist means is the character with which the reader is meant to sympathize and empathize with. And the reason why I think is connected to what you've just highlighted. That to use an Aristotelian way of thinking about it, the telos of fiction very well may be to convey that theme, to convey that thesis. And why might I say that? Well, if we are meant to sympathize and empathize with the protagonist, and if the protagonist is meant to go through some small or large amount of self transformation in order to overcome the conflict, right? And that's delving into what I would say is an inevitable plot structure. I separate that from
Mhm.
plot types because there's different ways to have this structure present itself. But fundamentally, I think that three-act structure, Freytag's triangle, and the if we're talking about it in terms of theater and drama, I think that's an inevitability. I'll ask you about that here in a moment. And we'll see if that holds water, my claim there. But to say the telos or the purpose, or I like to use the word function, because I try
Mhm.
to, if I can, strip out as much subjectivity and speak as objectively as I can about
Sure.
these things. The telos is for the reader, and tell me if you think this is right, so I can actually open this up for you to comment on afterwards. I think that tell me if you think that the function, the purpose of a story is to teach, if you will, the reader the same lessons that the protagonist learns in order to overcome an analogous conflict in his or her own life. Does that sound reasonable, or am I stretching there?
No, I think you're spot on. I mean that's sort of the mark of a good work of fiction, right? And of course, there are fiction novels that are pretty strictly plot and may not have sort of an advanced themes. But in most fiction novels, the ones that readers really tend to sort of bond with and have an emotional connection with, they're seeing those themes take shape as they read, and they're learning the lesson with the protagonist or with the main character, depending on how the those character devices are used and how that shakes out. They're going to learn that lesson and be able to modify it for their own circumstances, right? For the kite runner is one that comes to mind, right? So readers are reading about this child Amir, who has witnessed something very horrible, who doesn't feel like he can talk about what has happened, and gets in the beginning of the story, overhears his father talking about another dad being disappointed in their child, and hears that a boy who won't stand up for himself becomes a man who can't stand up for anything. And I'm paraphrasing here, so I don't have the book in front of me, but as readers go through that story, they're going to see Amir go through, sort of the status quo life before, his sort of big transformation as being a boy who can't stand up for himself, a quiet child who refuses to speak and refuses to interact when there's a risky situation. And it's not until readers get close to the end where Amir has had this sort of transformative moment where people have been executed. The Amir's being pushed to go back home. Get this other child from the orphanage. There's all of this stuff going on in his life. It feels very big, very heavy for a child, and it's at a moment where Amir is reminded of the theme, and he wonders if he's become someone who can't stand up for anything. And that's the moment where he is able to transform, to reflect on what that means for him, reflect on the person that he wants to be, to look back on, what he's done up to this point and make critical changes to be someone who can stand up for himself and for others. And I think that, that story in particular and others, they're going to be the kind of stories that encourage readers to stand up for themselves. Even if it's not in the same way that Amir does it, readers can adopt that message into their own lives to say, okay, well, Amir had this horrible set of circumstances happen to him, and yet he was able to see something bigger in himself. He was able to transform and do good for himself, and I can do that too. And so that's where the subjectivity of the reader's experience really comes in, is sort of taking that lesson in the novel format, in the fictional setting, and being able to transform that into something that's applicable in the real world.
Yeah, that opens up a question, right? So, like, if and perhaps there's two questions that are fighting in my mind. Which one should come first? I'll stick with the first one that came to mind. Is
Mhm.
if this is the case, right? Like, say, we're both authors, we're both writing novels. Um,
Mhm.
let's assume that there's going to be some theme, there's going to be some claim, some lesson in there. Why do it in fiction, right? Because there's a question there. Would it someone might ask, wouldn't it be clearer just to, I don't know, write a thesis out in an essay, right, rather than to embed it into a work of fiction where reader interpretation um, could very possibly, spoil that message? Why fiction? Why are we doing this?
I love this question. I love this question so much. So fiction novels in particular it's not just made up stories, right? A good fiction novel is a microcosm of reality. It sort of takes a situation and puts it into a storytelling format for a broad audience using a ton of different devices. And you can adapt fiction to almost anything. Narrative nonfiction and essays about, let's take a Mir's lesson, you stick up for yourself, become a person who sticks up for themselves. That's a really great thing to essay about. But is an essay going to persuade somebody to make the necessary change in their lives to drive forward that action? Maybe, but maybe not. Humans are hardwired for storytelling. It comes from our pre-written language oral traditions. We know stories in a big way, and sort of the oral history and sort of things have been passed down for generations and generations, and so we have this natural tendency to gravitate toward story, not just narrative, but actual storytelling. And so when you can use a fiction story to communicate something in the real world on a deeper level, I think it has great capacity to reach far more people than narrative nonfiction ever could. There are some people who are just never going to be interested in reading nonfiction. They're not going to be interested in essays, in self-help, in even in memoir, on some level, depending on who the memoirist is and what their life experience was. But Lots and lots of people read fiction, and they read fiction probably a little bit for some escapism, but also to learn something about the world and about themselves through the medium of fiction and through storytelling. It's actually why I focus on fiction editing at large, because I think there's something so beautiful in the power of a fiction story to communicate what is, otherwise could be really intense topics to talk about in a nonfiction way. I think about dystopian stories, speculative fiction horror novels that talk about sort of the fall of man and moral decline and discipline. And we can rave all day long about moral decline and and shake a fist at all of the stuff that's going on. But isn't it more powerful to hear or to sort of understand what that means by reading it in a story that we can sort of connect with, a protagonist that we can root for, a plot line that we're excited by, and a finish to a story that satisfies on its sort of the deepest level.
I couldn't agree more. A bunch of thoughts populated in my mind as I was listening to you. Are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt and his he's got a number of works, but his book The Righteous Mind by chance?
I don't believe I'm familiar with that one.
Okay, so I think he actually took this from somebody else, but he talks about human beings as being like an elephant rider, as opposed to, I think it was Plato who talked about human beings being like a charioteer. And the reason
Mhm.
why he preferred the elephant rider to the charioteer is that a charioteer has a fair amount of control over the horses and where the chariot goes. And Plato was, he was thinking in terms of, well, where this rational, well, not quite rational animal. That's more Aristotle, who's more reasonable than Plato, to be frank.
Sure.
But he felt that, yeah, he felt that our logical sense of ourselves and our ego, he wouldn't have used that word, but had a lot of control. But if you think of an elephant rider, which I think is much more akin to how a human being is, we have this, this ego, this consciousness, this capacity for rationality, but it's like a little dude sitting on top of this whole creature. And when push comes to shove, if you're riding an elephant and the elephant wants to go left, you can try, you can try to convince it to go right. But if it decides to do that, that's the way it's going to go.
Mhm.
And if I, take that metaphor and break it down, that is, I think, most of our human selves, right? I think this is perhaps a post-enlightenment problem, where we assume ourselves to be entirely the rational creature. We assume that which we're consciously aware of and consciously accept is that which we believe. But I think really it's not the case. If it was the case, we would see the exact opposite of what you laid out, right? People would be convinced and persuaded by and interested in reading um, nonfiction, and particularly non-narrative nonfiction, which is
Mhm.
not the case, right? Like
Yeah.
even amongst the best nonfiction writers, right? They utilize stories in their books. I mentioned Jonathan Haidt. He does it.
Mhm.
I've got a couple books by the listeners know I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. He just tells stories like over and over and over
Yes.
again. That's most of his books, right?
Mhm.
And so people are obviously not, let's say, compelled and moved by that pure rational part of their brain. You can almost never get anyone to willingly subject themselves to, reading raw philosophy, but you can get someone to read a story. And this is what I think. The cool thing is, someone doesn't actually have to know they learned something to learn something from a story, right?
Yes.
The theme operates, that's my proposition. The theme operates at the unconscious level, which means you adapt it into you, whether you're aware or not. You think that's fair?
I do. I do. It's actually something we talk about at home. I have a young daughter, and I make it. I make an intentional practice of reading novels in front of her so that she can see. what reading can do, and she gets a hall pass. I mean, I don't care how late she stays up if she's reading. She's been a kid who from a year and a half old has had books available to her even at bedtime because of the power of reading. There's never a wrong time to read, and there's never like sort of a bad outcome from reading a novel. You're always going to learn something, whether it's command of language, arrangement of ideas, whether it's learning how to sort of pick out and adopt those powerful lessons. There's never a bad way to read, or a bad time to do it, I suppose.
Well, here's a bit of a fun contradiction. I don't know if this is correct. So I had a conversation with a fellow friend and acquaintance. I call him Captain all the time. His name's Michael. We were talking about the influences on new writers from particularly the mediums of anime and manga. We're not. I'm not going to ask specific questions about that, but one of the contentions that we came up with was that actually it is possible. Um, for someone to be, we posited that it's possible for someone to be negatively influenced. And we just mentioned the very great and I think it's a invaluable capacity to teach someone through narrative. Uh, is it would it be fair then to say it's actually also a potentially dangerous tool as it is useful because it operates underneath the level of, let's say, any form of rational scrutiny? Could someone be, let's say, fooled or tricked or manipulated into believing some, like learning a lesson that does not correspond to the real world? Do you think that's possible?
I suppose it could be possible. I think about The Catcher in the Rye. That's the novel that sort of came to mind, and I don't know how many of us had to read that story for school in one at one time or another, or who encountered it in our lives. But that story is very much a coming of age, and it's been a long time since I've read it, so I don't remember many of the fine details. But in conversations about the novel in general, there's sort of this underlying feeling of almost nihilism, right? So it's possible for someone to read a story and to get something negative out of it. It's not worth it. And so I'm gonna just not do what I want to do, or not do what drives me. So that is a potential consequence of it, but that is also subjective to the person. And I would posit that that person who pulls something negative from stories on a constant basis probably is pulling that negativity in other areas of their life as well. It might be related to the psychology of the person, more than the content of the reading material.
Mhm. That reminds me, I've got to, again, to keep generating multiple questions at the same time.
Sure.
That, but that also though reminds me of I think it was an aphorism recently, or maybe it's one from forever ago. You think I would remember, but I write them and then they like fall somewhere in the back of my head. Uh,
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever read "Thus Spake Zarathustra." Have you read that esoteric novel?
No, I have
Uh,
not.
well, it's a huge endeavor, so you may not be missing much. But there is a particular really funny line where one of the characters points out that Zarathustra contradicted himself like from 100 pages ago, and
Sure.
Zarathustra's response is great. And as an author, once you've written a lot, you've probably experienced this. He's like, what, do I have to carry my ideas around with me in a cask? Like sometimes a dove
Yeah.
just flieth away, right? And I think that's absolutely the case. But this aphorism I wrote, I think it was morale taste, like morale with an e at the end. But there was an idea I had that a someone's tastes in anything really, but let's confine it to the context of art, particularly the context of reading and fiction, is interrelated with, let's say, a type of development of that person's attitude toward the world. And these, I'm not going to delve too far into that because I think it would be a rabbit hole, but I think the next couple questions will end up interrelating. We'll see. So I wanted to ask if you thought it was possible, since we're talking about theme, we're talking about the argument or thesis of a story. We've talked about the possible reader interpretations. Do you think it's possible that a story, specifically a story with a narrative, I want to make that that'll become clear to the listeners here in a second why I'm harping that down. But do you think it's possible that a story has no theme?
Is it possible that I think a story has no theme?
Like, yeah, that you
Um,
could write one without one.
I think if you had asked me that a decade ago, I would have said yes. Because writers have different styles. Everyone comes from a different place. The beginning writer is going to write differently than the very advanced writer. And so I think in my younger years I would have said yes, it is possible to write a story with no theme. But as I get older and I encounter more novels, I less and less I believe that to be true. I believe it is possible for an author to write a story without theme in mind, but I do not believe it's possible for readers to take away nothing from a story that may stick with them. One thing that I sort of come back to as a reader for myself is that it's I don't always remember the fine details of stuff. I'm not going to necessarily remember the characters' names. I'm not going to remember the minor details of a plot line. I'm going to remember how a novel made me feel, whether it persuaded me to think about things differently, and what I took away from it. So I'm definitely a thematic reader, probably based on that. But I don't think it's possible for a story to be completely devoid of themes. Something is going to come into play during the course of the storytelling process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. And you had mentioned right there at the end, as part of the story process, I built
Mhm.
an argument around the fact that actually a story itself is a theme generating human construct, essentially, right? Like
Yes.
that's what a story is. Um, you mentioned Catcher in the Rye, and it seemed seeming. I admittedly have not read it. I was supposed to read it in high school, but I was not a reader then, and
Sure.
I found the narrator insufferable. Have you, by the way, if you hear a cat, my neighbor's cat is trying to come into my apartment, so I apologize for any of you listening. Uh, but no, so when I was in graduate school, I went to the University of Tampa for creative writing. I really appreciate all my time there. My professors were great. But I did notice that everyone had a this kind of will to originality, and they're always trying to subvert something. That's kind of popular in our postmodern era. Um, but I've seen a lot of authors try to subvert plot and to subvert theme. Um, Now, Fallon, if you had a client and they came to you and they said, "I'm going to try and subvert plot or subvert theme," um, what would you tell them, and what would you think would be the result if they tried to do that?
I think it would make for a messy read, quite honestly. There's something about, we talked about the storytelling process, the sort of the oral tradition, the hard wiring that humans have towards storytelling. And one of the things that people look for in stories is theme, whether they know it or not. It's just part of sort of the clue finding mission as you go through a story as a reader. When and I've heard authors say this, not so much about plot or theme, but about structure. Oh, I don't want to use a structure for my novel because I want my novel to be original. Okay, but if you use no structure, your story is not going to make sense, right? If you ask a question at the beginning of the novel, you have to answer it by the end of the novel. I mean, hard stop. Otherwise, readers are going to get totally lost. They're not going to understand what they just read, why it's important, and why it's relevant to them. So there are little things that we have to do to keep readers engaged and to get them all the way from that opening chapter to the big finale, to get them sort of that final conclusion. So subverting theme or subverting plot, I guess arguably there are some pretty plotless stories, right? To the Lighthouse comes to mind. um and if you've never read To the Lighthouse, the major plot is a bunch of family members who say that they want to go to a lighthouse, and they spend an entire Saturday making plans to get to the lighthouse. It's just it's a non-plot plot, right? But it's all about character development. It's a literary fiction, so the story isn't really about how they get to the lighthouse. It's about all of the other stuff they're dealing with on a day when they need to be there. So it's just, even that kind of story that has almost no plot still has a basic plot. It's something for the characters to do, and the plot in that situation also interacts with the primary protagonist's goal, right? If the goal is to get to the lighthouse, the plot is going to surround that. So I think it's interesting to hear authors say that they want to subvert one thing or the other, or they want to, they're sort of rugged originalist, and I don't want my story to look like anything else. And I would say that is not possible. Stories follow a specific pattern and a specific structure for a reason, is what humans understand as we digest information. Rather than focusing on originality, which, at this point, with all of the topics and all of the stories and all of the worlds that people have created, is really, really difficult to do, to have something that's so fresh that no one's ever seen it before. Instead, I focus on, talking with authors about what uniqueness they want to infuse into that story and help them enhance that part of it. So that, while the story itself may not be totally original, the way that they communicate that story and the way that they talk about that theme in their message to their readers is what becomes the original element of the story.
Yeah, it's the unique emergent property between the author of the text, and the reader that brings
Right.
something new out, rather than it being just pure originality there, pure novelty. Um, yeah, so whenever I've seen people try to subvert plot, I have the same essential reaction, right? It's like someone has failed to realize that a story is the structure, right? Like,
Mhm.
we could, I think this is Aristotle as well. A thing is, it's many things that come together. He'd say it's its mover, so where it comes from, its form and its substance, as well as its telos, its function or its purpose.
Right.
And to try and strip out the form, that'd be like, well, I want to plant and grow a tree, but I don't want it to have the form of a tree. And then I would start to ask this person, like, what are you saying then? Uh,
Yes.
right? Right. And furthermore, I think the result ends up being and ends up having a theme, right? Like, so if you try to, I've made this argument many times, and I think it's worth making again, particularly on this particular episode of the podcast, is that if you try to subvert theme, or if you try to not have a theme, one of two things will happen. Either one, a theme will get in there because it's a product of the structure that is what a story is, because so if you're
Mhm.
writing a story, it has a structure, because otherwise it isn't a story, and then therefore it has a theme whether you want it to or not. Or if you're successful enough, what happens is it becomes one particular theme, that I think readers almost universally hate, which is nothing matters. And that's what you've referred to it very kindly as a messy read. And that's true. It is messy when that happens, but I think it's, I would argue, worse than messy. And the reason why is because it's a story that insults the reader by wasting their time with a message that nothing, including this book that you're reading, matters. So why should you care, right? I think
Right.
that's the real danger there when someone is trying to subvert theme. Now, oh, go ahead. Do you have something to say?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that that sort of pairs with, why does the reader care then? if you're doing all of the subversion and you're trying not to tell a story while telling a story, then the reader is going to be confused. Messy is the word I chose, but I think it is something beyond messy. It's sort of catastrophic, and then readers aren't going to get it. There's no reason for them to stay and engage with a story that isn't a story. Um, yeah, it's such an interesting thing to think about.
So this is a question I've been wanting to ask for a while. I think now is the right time to ask it. So we talked a lot about author intention for a theme being put there. We've talked about the fact that the theme can get put there regardless of whether the author intended, um, and that brings about questions of whether or not themes ought to be determined beforehand, as opposed, right? Because you have to ask compared to what. So the author could go in with a theme in mind, or should an author discover the theme um, through a particular method? I'll outline it shortly, hopefully within a sentence or two. Um, because the reason why I ask this question is I posit that the let's say that originality that you mentioned before that emerges from the author, the text, and the reader together is actually the product of the conflict being a conflict that the author didn't already know how to solved or came up at least with one genuine try of a solution during the writing and revision of the text that then the reader shares in that experience with in the same way that the author learned something through the development of the story and then the reader experiences that secondhand. That would be that's kind of the wild isle literature recommendation for a theme as opposed to coming in with a theme fully packaged and function and fully finished in
Yeah.
mind before the writing begins. Do you find that you can come in with a theme in mind beforehand, or uh, is it dangerous to not have a theme fully formed, like I've just described coming in?
No, no, not at all. I would say it's not dangerous to come into manuscript revisions without a theme in mind. I think, sort of the development of theme is a multi-step process in many cases. And generally, the writer, the author they're going to think about the story idea on some level. Why is this story important for me to write? Why am I interested in telling this tale? Why am I, interested in this? What's concerning my main character? Why does it concern me? And through that process, when the writer sort of brings that story into the developmental revision space, then it becomes not so much a story, like the purpose of enhancing. It's more unearthing. So yes, the character is going through this, they're doing these things with the plot, but what themes emerge through the process of revision? In that case, it's the theme is something that generally is going to come out. It's going to be evoked from within the text. It's usually not something that's imposed on the story. And if a writer tries too hard to impose that theme on the story, readers often will pick it out and they'll see it looks forced. It's sort of squashing a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't always work. But when you look at what's on the page, when you look at the plot, when you look at the characterization, when you look at what's happening, when you look at the big ideas behind the story, why the author was interested in writing that story in the first place, tendrils of theme begin to emerge. And I think especially in the developmental editing space, whether you are an author developing your own stories or whether you're an editor working to help authors develop their stories, it's really sort of stepping back from the story and finding those threads of theme in the pages. Okay, now, as I'm going through this revision process, now I can see the themes emerge. Now I can see sort of what the meaning is behind the story, bigger than what the writer may have initially imagined. So I think it's okay to come in with an idea of what you want that story to say, but know that in the writing process, in the craft of storytelling, the theme itself or the big message may change necessarily really depending on the outcomes of the work.
Absolutely right. I really liked how you worded that. So inevitably, you got an idea, otherwise you wouldn't be writing the story. But you started out
Right.
saying, at the author asking him herself, why am I interested? What is pulling me in this direction? Or why is it that I think this is actually the case? And then you mentioned an unearthing, a discovering, a finding. We could think of it as a developing. And yeah, it has to be. It absolutely has to be. I don't know how many times I write in a kind of niche space, and I interact with other authors in this niche space, and a lot of them are actually very, very talented. Though I also see quite a lot. Actually, I see this from the mainstream. We see this everywhere. Even Rand, we mentioned before, and I like Rand. I happen to be one of those like kooky, like ANCAP libertarian types. So like
Hmm.
Ayn Rand's great. Atlas Shrugged, there are some great things about it, but sometimes it does hit you like over the head.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
you mentioned, like cramming like a square peg into a round hole. I imagine someone with
Yes.
like a giant ham, like ham fisted, and like they've got these hammers tied to their hands, and they're boxing you into the ground as what's his name? John Gulch gives the, I don't know, 40-page speech um, that no one would give. So yeah, when someone doesn't engage in that act of discovery, I think what ends up happening is the text feels. I use the word moralizing quite a lot. Like if the
Sure.
reader, I think experiences this where it's almost like the character turns to like the fourth wall on the page as we're just taking that metaphor away from film, and then just starts talking at you, telling you how to feel rather than
Hmm.
naturally evoking the feeling that the author could have evoked in him or herself through that natural process of discovery and rediscovery of the theme. Yeah, absolutely. I do think it really needs to be a discovery. Uh, while we still have some time, I wanted to get a little bit into the technical side of theme because this is actually something I offer as part of my services. I think your services inevitably have to touch on this as well, which
Hmm.
is, an author comes and they say, I've had clients tell me this, like, um, I want to actually write something deep. I don't want it to just be this, superficial blah. Um, so from the technical side of things, we'll get your approach first. So you have a client that come in and tell you that. What do you say to them?
That they want to, when a client asks, how to make something bigger from the story, how to bestow a greater meaning on their fiction.
Yes.
Um, in the process, so one thing about sort of the developmental approach, for if you've ever done a developmental edit, I mean, you know that the first thing you have to do is read the work. You can't sit down and immediately start editing on page one, because without understanding the breadth and depth of the story and the characters, you have nothing to develop. It's in the course of that first reading where themes start to emerge, and that's something I communicate to authors, that if you want to infuse a story with theme, really, I guess you can start writing with a theme in mind. However, it's really in that revision process that you're going to get to that state of uncovering. So I'm going to look for certain things in the course of the author's manuscript. I'm going to look at that characterization and look, what are there social commentaries in this piece of work? Is there something about judgment? People are doing wrong uh, to themselves, or there's wrongdoing by others, and there's this sort of great feeling of social judgment at play. Classic works like The Scarlet Letter, pull that right to the front. But it's in a lot of novels. There's judgment on class, there's judgment on gender, there's judgment on race, there's judgment on country of origin, there's judgment on lifestyle. So all of those things sort of can be deeper themes. So what I would look for is, what are the elements that speak to me over the course of the manuscript, and then I talk with the author about, okay, here's what I see happening emerging themes in the story. Talk to me about what these things mean to you. Did I hit the mark? Did I miss the mark? And do you foresee something different? And more often than not, authors will tell me, well, you've actually shown me a theme I didn't even intend. And it's because sometimes it really requires stepping back from the work entirely to be able to look at it objectively, to pull out the tendrils of theme there. So then it's just a process of talking to the author. Okay, so we've landed on the fact that, in this example, that judgment is a theme. So how do we communicate judgment to the readers? Which character is going to sort of epitomize this? Which is going to be the good judge? Which is going to be the sort of the not good judge? And how do we sort of pit those characters against each other to really pull that out? So it's in the course of developmental edit, sort of keeping in mind that it's not just smoothing the language and moving this exposition paragraph into something that's dialogue specific. It's really not about that at all. It's reimagining or re-envisioning the story as a whole, like looking at the scenes to see, does this scene do what I want it to do? Is there a purpose? Is there a beginning, a middle, and an end? Am I going to go through this process and come away with with a greater understanding of the work? Is every piece of this story needed? Does it appear to be intentional? And does it communicate the story that I want to tell readers? And so we go through the process to figure out what is going to be the best way to deliver this to the reader at the end. I'm working with an author now whose story has changed so completely from the first iteration. A manuscript I read at near the end of last year is almost nothing like the manuscript I'm reading today, and it's because of the enhancement of theme and the restructuring of scenes and character art to get to that theme that transformation could reasonably take place.
Yeah, what you've done there is you just touched on an aspect of the subtitle for this episode that we haven't got a chance to bring up yet, which I think is meta narrative. And when you mention pulling back, looking at the whole of the story in order to be able to see what it's actually conveying, right? So you could, because when you're in the trenches, your head, like if you're for those of you who might be potential authors, like you're thinking about writing a book or a story. Here's something that happens when you're writing it. You're down in there. You're in a scene or you're in a chapter. You're in a sentence, and it's very difficult to see outside of the scope of what you're dealing with at that time and moment. You really have to step back far enough to see the whole of the story, right? Like it's like you can't appreciate a grand vista if you're down on the ground. You have to really go up on the mountain to really be able to see it all and take it all in. Um, Now, that again, we beg many questions on this show, and it's really like, what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about the meta narrative, that grand message that you see from pulling back? I'm going to throw a couple ideas out here and you tell me what you think. So, when I think of this term meta narrative, it's a narrative on top of the narrative, right? But then what do we
Mhm.
mean on top? Well, we just talked about going up on the mountain to see the whole view, right? So it's when I say on top, that's a metaphor for a type of abstraction and generality, right? Because when you're seeing a broader view, you're seeing a more general view. Uh,
Sure.
why? Why more general though, right? Because you would think, well, wouldn't the specific hit harder? Yes, it would, which is why we're telling a story and not writing an essay like we mentioned before. But so what I mean by general is I mean more, I'm going to combine two terms that don't really go together: human, universally relatable, right? So um, I'll pitch this part of the conversation back to you, right? So would you say that when you're seeing theme, you're seeing essentially a generalized abstract version of the story, and that generalized abstract version of the story is what lets the all the different types of people coming to read the story to relate to it, right? Like
Yes.
the theme is in that upper level.
I think so. I think the theme is the thing that makes the story universal. right? If we go back to the Atlas Shrugged example, since we're both familiar with that piece of work, not every reader is going to identify with Dagny Taggart. That's just she's a very different person than I am. I certainly don't identify with her. I'm not. Money is not my end goal in life, but I think aside from the sort of philosophical sort of implant and musing that Rand did in the course of the novel, the sort of major message behind Atlas Shrugged is that every reader should do what they can to be the best that they can be. Right. So, and that is a big universal message that can speak to anyone at any time. Be the best that you can be. And it doesn't matter if you agree with objectivism, in philosophical terms. It doesn't matter if you're, politically libertarian or, sort of anarcho-capitalist or what have you. You can still be the best person that you can be, regardless of, your political leanings, your socioeconomic status, what have you. So themes really do tap into the universality of the human experience and sort of bridge the gap between the reader having a specific experience, which, for fiction novels, most readers are not having the exact same experience as the protagonist or the viewpoint character is having, but they may sort of be able to universally adopt that big thesis, that big theme.
Yeah, but for Atlas Shrugged in particular, there's a question.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's like a bunch of characters ask it to each other. It's like, are
Yes.
you going to take responsibility, or are you going to be responsible? Meaning
Yes.
responsible for the consequences if something goes wrong. Usually, is the context. And yeah, and
Yes.
the heroes always say yes, right? They're always like, yes, I'm the one willing to take responsibility. Um, so there, I guess Ayn Rand and JBP can get along in that context,
Yes,
right?
very
Uh,
much.
in that one, perhaps not in others. From a technical perspective, you mentioned, readers aren't going to have the specific experiences that are present in the book, but they can still relate because of that meta narrative.
Mhm.
That really leads us to talk about symbols, and it leads us to talk about this concept order abstraction that I've taken like third hand from like Thomas Aquinas, who I think developed that off of Aristotle. Um, but I think we should talk about symbols first before I jump into order abstract. Oh, maybe I can talk about them at the same time. So I'm gonna pitch my idea for symbols at you, and you tell me how this compares to how you think about symbolism in fiction. So when I think about symbols, I actually think about them in a more objective form. This is partly because I have a bit of personal study background with Yoon and a little bit with Campbell, and there are certain symbols that seem to occur universally among humankind across culture and across time. And I think that those symbols are how we convey the component parts of theme across a narrative. And I think we do this through a process called order abstraction. Now, um, I'm going to make this because this took me forever to understand. I think I've managed to boil it down into an understandable way. So there are, well, there can be depending on how you do it, but I typically work with three orders of abstraction. First, second, and third. First being the
Mhm.
most specific, third being the most general. So third being the closest in relation to the theme, first being the closest in relation to the specific narrative elements that the author wrote down on the page. So the first order is a reference to a specific thing. So if we have a particular character like Dagny Taggart, right? To use her as an example, she is a specific person. It's still an abstraction because we're referring to a person. We have the idea of a specific person. But then we might go into second order, and second order might be something like a category that she belongs to, right? So this might be the ambitious businesswoman, right? Because that's definitely one of the things that she is. Now, there's going to be multiple categories in which she fits into, but that refer to her as a group of, let's say, concrete beings. That's second order abstraction. And then Third order abstraction is where we've moved beyond the concrete. Now, when we describe the categories above those categories, right? Um, we're not referring to concrete. So to use Dagny Taggart, who is the ambitious businesswoman, and we might say the third order abstraction of her as a symbol is, let's say, uh, one whose telos is, let's say, success and uh, domination in the material space, something like that. Like we're not referring to any particular concrete person at that point, but we've hit such a level of generality that you're going to have many, 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 many people be able to relate to that third order of abstraction where, yeah, I've had this experience. In fact, it's now divorced away from specifically business women to anyone or thing that experiences that drive of fulfillment and meaning through, in fact, get it away from even materialism, right? Because it's
Mhm.
beyond that. It's someone who has a drive and purpose for taking responsibility, or perhaps you could say third order abstraction symbol for Dagny Taggart is the drive to have a meaningful, purposeful existence through the taking of responsibility in one's own hands to be the highest potential self. Something as big and broad as that, right? You notice that you get more words as you go up the order. So that's how I think of symbol. I know that was kind of lengthy. It was very dry and academic. I apologize for going on so long. Does that relate at all to how you approach symbol? Do you have a similar or totally different approach?
I think mine's a little bit different. I look for symbols to figure out sort of what things are coming up over and over, sort of beyond theme. What visual images am I seeing in the course of the story? And do these things have an accepted sort of general meaning, right? So if there are colors present, do those colors have meaning that people would recognize? Is sort of the easy example is, green can mean sort of greed or envy, right? So if you've got a character who is, maybe not so good a person, who is greedy and selfish, the writer may enhance that by depicting that character often wearing green. So it's a subtle way to infuse that meaning without having to beat your reader over the head with it. Symbols are, there are lots of things that have a set meaning already. So, think of the color black, for example. Black, you think of like a little black dress or black tie, nice. Black brings an air of sophistication, there's elegance, there's some level of formality, but black can also be, sort of a color of grief or death. So depending on how that character is operating in the course of the novel, and so what they're doing, what the mood is, that may result in a suggestion to the author to, like, maybe think about the colors that you're using in this space, because this person has gone to this event, and it's supposed to be, the sophisticated, elegant thing, but they're wearing yellow, which is not at all, it's not, it doesn't fit the theme of the night. So if the thing that they're wearing is so vastly different from what they're trying to be, it has to have a purpose, right? Maybe that person really is a coward. Maybe that person is using this event to, for dishonest means, trying to get something for themselves out of it. And in that case, the choice of yellow is appropriate, right? So it really comes down to what's already present and how the author intends the mood or the meaning, and whether that shines through. And sort of often it comes down to intentionality, especially with symbols. I think symbols are one of those things, I think, that writers probably don't come into the story with already. They're probably not going to come in and be like, I'm going to write the story and I want red to be a symbol, and I'm going to use red intentionally in every single chapter, and it's going to have a sort of this divine purpose. Usually that's not the case. Usually that's something that comes out in the revision process as you learn the themes and then learn how to leverage symbols to enhance that theme.
Yeah, I also find that the symbolism, some of the symbolism I'll discover I put there by accident in a first draft,
Hmm.
but there's a ton of it. Perhaps at least half. I know in my experience, it gets there with revision for the reason you described
Hmm.
earlier. Because when you're in the trenches, right, you can't see the big picture, the vista, so you miss a bunch of the opportunities. Do you think that with symbols that obviously some are culturally and context dependent, and others seem to be universal. Do you think that's fair to say, or do you think it's there's going to be some people who are gonna, some listeners perhaps even, who are going to argue all one way or all the other, or do you think it's
Yeah.
a mixture?
I think it can be a mixture. I mean, I'm certainly not an anthropologist, so I'm not going to be able to give you a history lesson on the themes across the world. But there are some, certain symbols that pop out that show up over and over, colors being one, appearances of certain things, feathers, bridges, chains, bones, water. All of those things have generally meaning that people already understand, even if they don't know they understand it. I mean, how many music videos have you seen where it's raining? And that's
Yeah.
intentional, right? People know that, the visual of rain is indicative of sadness or grief on some capacity, and so there, it's an easy way to bring sort of meaning into a space. But in some cases, the symbol is really context dependent and may be specific to the story. And I think that can be especially true in speculative fiction. When the author is creating a world for themselves. So, when you're building a whole new world, you don't necessarily want to rely on the constants of Earth in this time and space to build something new, right? Then it just becomes like Earth 2.0. So in that space, I think it's okay to sort of explore what those symbols can be, what they mean to the people living there, and sort of adopt them into the cultural mindset of the world building at large. So it really, I think the answer is both, is really context dependent, but there also are some symbols that are universal and that people pick up inherently.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree that it's both. Writing speculative fiction myself, I'll do a little bit of research into folklore, and there are some very particular parochial symbols, particularly with like folklore about fairies and such. But then there's
Mhm.
other things that are like hyper universal. You mentioned music videos and raining, right? And like, to tie together, because I really think our two approaches to symbols and the relationship to theme are spot on. Uh, if I spot, I shouldn't have said spot on. I should say the same. I think we come from a particular, just different backgrounds, probably.
Sure.
Um, so to tie in yours with mine, because I think I could do this on the fly. So we've got rain, right? And rain can be a lot of things. You might have cultural context specific things, like if you are peoples from a desert, the rain is great. The rain, you're going to hyperfixate on the fact that the rain is a nourishing force
Mhm.
that has come to revitalize the barren desert. But at the same time, even those type of people are going to have some associations with the rain and something like tears, right?
Mhm.
Because rain emulates those things. Rain is being immersed in water. Water is, because I'm a union, like total union, water is the place underneath which you drown, which you are surrounded. It's a object of the unknown that has no fixed form, right? So you've also got those elements, and those are always going to be present, right? Uh, even if you are one of, let's say, I don't know, you're on Dune, you're one of the freemen. There is
Mhm.
there is something to rain that's going to be associated with crying, because crying, even to them, crying is like shedding water, this great sacrifice, right?
Yes.
To express grief. So yeah, absolutely, you can play. And that Dune, I didn't even mean to do that, but Dune is a great example of how you can play with um, how symbols operate. All right, we're running out of time. Um, I think to wrap this up, why don't we throw out for our listeners? We've done a few examples already, but is there a particular story, a particular book at which the theme really, really impressed itself upon you that you might recommend to a potential author to, or just reader to read, particularly for the theme?
So that's a great question. I'm going to say no, because reading is a personal experience for everybody, and the novels that I love may not be the novels that someone else does. But I would encourage folks to go back and read some of those books that they maybe had to read in school and didn't understand why, and reread them with theme and symbolism in mind and see what comes out of the rereading experience. There's something, I'll give an example from my own life. I am a huge fan of The Great Gatsby, and I know it's tired and boring and everybody loves The Great Gatsby and whatever, but it's a horrible story. These are terrible characters. They're selfish, they're entitled, they're basically adult brats. And you don't necessarily pick that up in The Great Gatsby when you read it in school, right? It's about prosperity and it's about wealth and it's about achievement and it's about all this stuff. But when you reread it as an adult and you look at some of the things that come out in the story, you see sort of the sadness in prosperity and what that actually means for Jay Gatsby, who can't live an authentic life, who can't actually answer the question directly when asked what he does for work. There's a lot of mystery there. There's secrecy there. He's sort of hiding his authentic self in pursuit of money. So there's a lot of stuff baked in that maybe stands to be gleaned from a second reading of some of those classics. So that's probably the biggest suggestion I can give is read a story you already know, but read it through a different lens and see if you find something different in a second reading.
I'm going to jump on that and second that to read the classics. I'll take a little bit of a different angle on it. I do agree though, but that there's just tons of stuff that the first time I had read
Mm-hmm.
it, I didn't understand at all. Particularly when we're made to read these things as young people, often
Mm-hmm.
in high school with teachers. I don't know, but if you're how your school experience was, but mine was particularly in public school was miserable. The teachers were not really, they could not participate and actually have the conversation that we had here today. I'll say it that way. And so when I started teaching, and I started, reading through the textbooks I was supposed to teach from at a university level, what I found was that particularly in regard to theme, um, the interpretations were a little bit lazy and atrocious, and by a little bit I mean like really lazy and atrocious. Um, this whole conversation we talked about how theme is really the thesis. You use the word motif, and if that's the word that a listener might happen to use, I think that's fine because, like I said before, it's beginning as theme and motif get used interchangeably across
Mm-hmm.
academia, frustratingly so. But sticking with the word theme, just for the sake of it, you know, uh, if if you're taught that a theme is a thing, it very well may not be. Oh, and here's what I want to say: theme as thesis, right? Um, you're oftentimes in school taught, let's say, the theme as being a singular word. And one of the things I learned teaching composition in particular was trying to impress upon my students and, oh, you listeners, please have this impressed upon you. A thesis is like a fully articulated argument. It's a claim that a thing is true. If X plus Y, then Z. Something like, obviously it's more complicated than that, but
Sure.
something like that, right? There's something being claimed that's true about some human universal that we talked about is how the reader connects with the text and back to the author if they're all on the same page. And I would say for a lot of people, like for me, Shakespeare's plays, particularly Romeo and Juliet. Why Romeo and Juliet? Because one, I think that one's the easiest to enjoy as a young person. So I'm gonna
Sure.
say go back, either watch or you can watch that really goofy rendition of it as like Romeo plus Juliet with like Leonardo DiCaprio if you want, um, or you could read the stage play. But but go back and say, okay, this is a tragedy it ended in misery, similar to the Great Gatsby. And the question is, why? Like you said before, right? As an author, you're asking, why is it that I'm drawn to this? Why is it that this concludes
Mhm.
this way? And I would say to a lot of people, don't just take what a textbook gives you or what your professor tells you. Um, Go in and ask that question for yourself, and you're going to get a lot more out of the text than if you had just taken for granted the answers already available. All right, Fallon, before we go, I'm going to do a little outro here. So, for you listeners, thank you so much for listening through this whole podcast. I had a lot of fun. Before you go, consider checking out my other content. Like I said, I've got a bunch of other podcasts. You can find those on any of your podcast listening apps or on my website, wildislet.com. I have the Wild Isle Style Guide, particularly focusing on the style of prose that you're writing in. So, if you've got a manuscript and you're trying to develop yourself as an author and you want to stand out and reach the fullest, get the content of your work to reach its fullest potential in terms of composition, go check me out there and check out my novel, Want Smoke Broken. And I've got a blog and all kind of other things. And don't miss out on Fallon's work as well. Fallon, go ahead and let them know again where they can check out your work and where you offer your services.
Yes, thank you, Marquise. So again, my website is fallonedits.com. I'm also on LinkedIn as Fallon Edits and on Minds for the freedom sort of open source community as It's Me, Fal. So you're welcome to come into all of those spaces, and I'm happy to, even for folks who can't work with me directly or who are not ready to work with me directly. I'm happy to answer questions to jumpstart the writing process, to jumpstart the self editing process, and really am here to try to help authors to the extent of my abilities.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Fallon. Check out her stuff, everybody. Thank you for listening in, and we'll see you all next time.